Do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, I'm Michelle Mizner. I'm an editor and producer at Frontline PBS. As we spoke about before the screening, I also said before the screening it is a difficult film to watch, and now you understand fully what I mean. Thank you so much for staying and for witnessing what Mstislav and Zhenya and Vasilisa, the reporters who were on the ground in Mariupol, saw happen over the course of only 20 days. The war is now in its over 700th day, and what they would say is that Mariupol is just a small percentage of what has happened. As we worked on this film, Mstislav continued to report in other cities. I remember very distinctly having a phone call with him as he was documenting the aftermath of what happened in Bucha. So we were talking about this footage. He was still in the field, on the ground, filming, dispatching stories. One place, Bucha, also in Kharkiv, where he's from and grew up. And if you can imagine, Bucha was documented after the Russian troops had left, for the most part. What we see happened in Bucha is afterward. That's when reporters were really able to get in. Mariupol is covered in the way that it is here because of Mstislav and Zhenya and Vasilisa staying and documenting it in real time. And I just deeply want to acknowledge that as we talk about this film. And acknowledge you for staying here to watch it. And Anne is here to talk about the film as well. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
So I'm Dr. Livschiz, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of History at PFW. And so my responsibility is to serve as the moderator for the discussion, and also, as needed, to provide historical and political context for the conflict, to help, if there are questions, to help contextualize the film. And so before we open this up to audience questions, since we're so lucky to have Michelle here, who is the producer and the editor of the film, we thought that maybe we could start with some questions that specifically deal with the film itself. And maybe we can start with you letting us know kind of the genesis of the project. I know traditionally this would be a question that Mstislav would be the one answering, but since he's not here, maybe the kind of the genesis of the project and then how you got involved in it.
Sure. So Mstislav is a reporter and video journalist at the Associated Press, and he's been covering wars all over the world for, at the time of this in 2022, it had been almost a decade that he'd been doing this work. And what he does, as you see in the film, is film events and very quickly edit it in the field. And dispatch it. And so the news reports that we're seeing from on the ground, and we saw from Mariupol on the ground in February of 2022 and going into March, were pieces that he was creating, and they were getting shown on different news networks, CNN, or that's AP dispatching their, sharing their material. First of all, I'll say in doing this work, he's become very, very good at it. He is an incredible filmmaker and storyteller, and has over the years perfected this craft of filming, editing, dispatching, filming, editing, dispatching, these very powerful scenes. He also, though, as you saw in the film, struggled to transmit everything that he wanted to show, and he left with a hard drive full of more. And so that's where Frontline PBS came in, and I'm on staff at Frontline and have the privilege of working with filmmakers like Mstislav to think about telling long-form stories, in this case, a feature film, that would assemble and think about how to take these incremental scenes and put them together to create something that, in Mstislav's words, and he hoped, would stand the test of time, not be as ephemeral as a news report that went out and maybe got lost amid the circumstances in which you're consuming it. You're having breakfast that morning, or you see it on social. It really something that would have staying power and would be a record for what happened in Mariupol. And that was his aim with making this a film. And so I worked with him, as I said earlier, he was continuing to report from the field and cover the story. We got the footage sent on its hard drive from Ukraine through London to where we were based in Boston. And I started having conversations with him about ideas he was having about how to construct it. I started logging all of the footage, watching everything. That's what you do as an editor and as a producer, thinking about the story, and would have long Zoom sessions with him at night while he, was back at his hotel or wherever he was staying, continuing to travel around Ukraine to cover the war. And eventually we were able to edit in person together for several weeks, and then we were able to premiere the film at Sundance. And so that's how he and I worked together, and he worked with the rest of our team from PBS and Frontline in Boston.
And so obviously, 20 days of footage. The film is 1 hour and 35 minutes. How hard was it to be able to decide what to include and what not to include? How did you? What principles guided you in deciding what is going to make it here and what?
Yeah. So one of the guiding principles was what he had already filmed and put together and edited. Like, so much of his work was so strong. And in the moment, and we wanted to be able to show how it was reflected in the news in real time. So this idea of seeing the sequences that he had covered show up in the news and how you see those paired next to each other in the film, that was part of how we thought about what we would show and how we would show it. At Frontline and at the AP, we share a lot of the same sort of journalistic values and principles and guidelines when we're approaching this kind of storytelling. So we're really sticking to the facts and chronology. And so that those two approaches are very aligned, which was useful, and that's what we considered as well as we were constructing the 20 days and how that would work. I have to say, for me, watching the footage, the raw footage, and sensing Mstislav as the person behind the camera, I think meant that, for me, it meant that we could tell the story in a different way, and in a way that you were really understanding who it was who was asking the questions, who the person on the other side of the camera was looking at and talking to, and you could hear his voice behind the camera. I think that was important in this case because it was somebody from the community that they were reporting on, and you could really feel that the both their access and their ability to do this reporting in an authentic, on-the-ground way, but also the way that people would be able to then talk to them and their comfort. And there's a scene where Ludmila, a woman, is upset, and she says, "Where are you boys from?" And he says, "Kharkiv." And you can just tell she's like, what is going on here? And they can just relate to journalists in a way when they're a local journalist, as opposed to at this time there were also a lot of people who were coming in from other countries to cover and then would leave. So they brought staying power and perspective that was so important. And I think because the scenes are so difficult, I also don't think we would have been able to keep them in the same way, assembled in the same way, if there wasn't Mstislav as the person behind the camera telling the story. And that is a personal feeling for me, honestly. I think I just felt like having somebody guide you through these horrific, terrible moments and ask you, please keep watching, please look. This is difficult, but it has to be difficult to watch, and really being alongside you as you're watching it, that made all the difference to me in editing the film. And so I think we tried to pull that into the storytelling itself.
And certainly his narrative, his voiceover narrative is such a compelling part of the film. And I think as a historian, one of the things that I think is that I would like to emphasize is the significance of it being a Ukrainian voice and Ukrainian voices. Certainly PBS and you and the others on your team have done an amazing job helping to amplify it. But the idea that this is not, that the editing is not, this is not what would the Western audiences like to see? What are we going to pick and choose from what's available? But an attempt by Ukrainian journalists to tell a Ukrainian story with the help of kind of the resources that they may not have. I think that that's part of what's so significant about having access to this information.
Yeah.
So thank you. And certainly I think, and this comes through in some of the questions that have already been submitted, I think a lot of people here would like to express their gratitude since nobody else, since the others involved in the film couldn't be there. Gratitude to you. Such powerful footage, such horrific footage. You having, I can't even imagine, I mean, watching an hour and 35 minutes of it is grueling. It's hard to imagine what it's like to watch hours and hours and hours of it for editing. So thank you, for the work that you did in order to be able to make this accessible to us and get this story told.
Thank you. Thank you for that. It was a privilege to get to work on this film, both because it was a moment in time. I think a lot of people were struggling with what was happening and what could be done and what could you asking yourself personally, what can I do? And I am very privileged to have a job where we're often reporting on conflicts that I somehow, even if it's vicariously, feel connected to because we're working on amplifying the story that's being told. In this case, I was also just so honored to be paired with someone like Mstislav, who was the right person, the right time to tell this story and truly met the moment. And I think is a filmmaker who we will see more work from, and I'm grateful for that. I hope that it's not under such dire circumstances all the time, but he's truly a talented director, and so this is something that has come from this project for the world to see that.
Thank you. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we open it up to questions?
No, let's open up to questions.
Okay, let's do it. Okay, we have some great questions already. Okay, so I think let's start. This is a great question. Given the rampant evidence of fake news, what are some of the best ways to speak truth to power? And I'll just, there are a couple of other questions that were related to this, questions about, certainly the documentary very explicitly engages with this question of, with this question of fake news. So maybe we should talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so also in logging the footage, which is the term we use for editors or washing everything down, so watching it, taking notes. I remember seeing the scene where Mstislav is on the phone with his editors and he's hiding under the stairwell outside with Vladimir and Zhenya, and they're getting internet. It's the only place in the city where you can still get internet. And he's having this phone call with his editors, and it's around the time that he learns that the reporting and the footage that they had gathered from the maternity hospital shelling was being misconstrued in Russian news. And so we put that sequence together to show how it had been used and distorted. And I remember being so impressed by the way that they thought about countering that narrative. And the fact of the matter is that if you start trying to argue, you've already lost. And instead what they did was just follow the same journalistic principles that you're supposed to as a journalist. You go and do the follow-up reporting. And so what did they do the next day? They go to find the victims. Where are they? What happened to them? Continue reporting the story. And by doing that, they're carrying through with they're speaking truth to power. They're continuing to gather the evidence and the material that's going to rise above, hopefully, misinformation and disinformation. However, it is a real concern, and it's something that we do have to think a lot about now, in this day and age, as information terrorism, and it's used as a tactic of war, even minimizing the access to news that people can have. So there's one scenario where you're not getting you're getting wrong information, and then there's another scenario which you also see play out in this in the city, is that it was an information blackout, and they didn't know what was going on, and so they would look to Mstislav, who was wearing a press helmet and a press vest, and they would say, tell us the news. Is Ukraine even a country anymore? How is Kharkiv? Like, they don't know because they're not getting that information. And so Vasilisa has said that in that moment she felt like, in some ways, the news and this work, like getting this news, was more important than food or water in some ways, because people were just so isolated. And it speaks to the power and importance of journalism and the work that they did, and also the work that we hope to continue to do by sharing films, like the film version of the story, so that people continue to understand the full perspective.
Thank you. And I do want to add, I want to add to this kind of just a little bit of broader context. And I think any time we have conversations about fake news and disinformation warfare, I think it is really, really important to mention the important role that Russia played in establishing disinformation warfare as a key strategy in modern warfare. And for propaganda purposes. Historically, I think one of the interesting things that we have seen, as a historian, one of the really interesting things that we have seen in probably the last decade when it comes to Russian international outreach, let's say, is that if in the 20th, for most of the 20th century, there was some attempt on the part of the Soviet Union to try to persuade the rest of the world that the rest of the world was bad while the Soviet Union was good, and try to persuade everybody to believe that there was kind of this positive, better alternative in the Soviet Union. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and especially in the 21st century, what we have seen from Russia is no longer an attempt to try to project any kind of positive, there's something good happening here as opposed to whatever is happening in your countries that is bad, but a shift to pure disinformation, right? Attack on the idea that there is such a thing as, a fact, that there is such a thing as truth. And the goal, right? The goal is simply to attack as many Western institutions as possible. Journalism, the concept of journalism as more than propaganda, concept of democratic institutions, and other kind of hallmarks of Western democracies. And the goal, right? The goal is to seed doubt and to undermine any confidence in all of those institutions. And certainly, kind of one of the interesting things that we saw in the beginning of the war, and this is why kind of the Ukrainian Voices component is such an important, is something that I wanted to emphasize early on. I think everybody is, Russia assumed that certainly in the area of propaganda and in the area of information, they would be able to maintain an upper hand in getting their story and their message out. And for a variety of reasons, including that there were a number of countries that shut down what were essentially Russian propaganda outlets, at least early on in the war, there was a kind of a disruption of Russian propaganda that allowed Ukrainian voices to be able to break through. And certainly as the war has been continuing, one of the things that we have seen is that that's something that is definitely starting to shift. Russian propaganda voices, once again, are getting amplified in Western media, either knowingly or unknowingly. Again, we can speculate the reasons why. And so these examples are so important, right? Because the Russian attempt to utilize its traditional strategies with, in some cases, at least early on in the war, limited effectiveness. But ultimately, of course, it's the kind of a testament to the work of the journalists to be able to get that information, to be able to counter these accusations. The other important thing to note, right, about fake news is that, of course, there's a lot of disinformation, and not all disinformation can be blamed on Russia. We have AI for that, right? We can blame AI for everything now instead of something else. But there's a difference between saying, oh, this is so awful, it can't possibly be true, right? And therefore we will look away because we just can't, we can't imagine something this horrific could possibly be happening in the 21st century, versus actual legitimate reasons to say, this may not be a reliable source, this is problematic, and so on. And so again, kind of the importance of the importance of critical thinking, right? The importance of making sure that we are that we're not simply looking away, claiming fakeness, and looking away because it's painful for us, because it's traumatic for us, because it's inconvenient for us, but for maybe other, better reasons. There was a question. Originally, I was going to go in order, but I think some of these kind of tie together really nicely. One of the questions was Russian reception, not to the information that was coming out, but to the film itself. This is a historic moment for Ukraine. This film was nominated. Hopefully, all of you know, right? This film was nominated for an Oscar in the category of documentary. This is the first time a Ukrainian film has been nominated in any category, right? And so it's an amazing historic moment. It's also tragic, of course, that it takes this level of horror and tragedy in order for a Ukrainian voice to be kind of placed on that. On that stage. So now with the additional visibility, has there been any pushback, kind of extra pushback from Russia on the film and the kind of message that it carries with it?
It certainly hasn't had a broadcast in Russia, and I think if you would like to see it and you live in Russia, there are ways to see it, but you would need to be seeking it out, and so that might give you some idea of the people who would be watching it. And so there hasn't been an official statement on the film that I'm aware of. However, any recognition or amplification of the film that has been received only puts it more on the radar of anyone who might have been unable to have visibility into its existence before. And so I think that's why we have felt so encouraged and heartened by any award or any time the film has been embraced, starting at Sundance where it premiered. It won the Audience Award there, and then has continued to travel around the world, and as audiences like you have come to the screenings and embraced both the film and the filmmakers and the journalists, I think it continues to lift up the film and the stories of the people of Mariupol and Ukraine in a way that more people will hear it, regardless of whether it's broadcast on their national networks or not.
Related to this question, there are a couple of really interesting questions about the kind of the film itself. The first one, how do you walk the line between showing the facts of what is happening with giving privacy and allowing people to grieve?
Yeah. So with those, Mstislav and the team followed in the field the same practices that they follow for the Associated Press anytime they're doing war correspondence. So they are wearing identifiable gear. They make sure it's okay to film the person, and if they are told not to film the person, you don't see them in the film because they put the camera down and they stop filming. They also did follow-up reporting on, and the reason why you see Mstislav ask names of people so often, some people have said, why would you interrogate them that way? And it's like, that's actually journalism. You need to get their name, you need to ask them questions, and then part of why they do that is to also be able to follow up with them. And so if you think about, part of their objective after the maternity hospital bombing was to find where the patients went. And so the reason why we know the names of Irina, who was the woman on the stretcher who died, the reason why we know Kirill's name and Evangelina's name, the two children who die, we know their names because they followed up and they talked to those families and continue to talk to those families as a part of their work. They have had, these are horrible experiences to witness, and I can only imagine what it would be like to be one of these parents. I do know, though, that there has been it is perhaps counterintuitive, but when you're the person being attacked, you ask more than ever for people to pay attention. And that's why you see the doctors invite the team into the hospital. Please, that's good, the press is here, keep filming. And that's what you see in the film a lot, is people say, please keep filming, keep filming.
And I think this is, I just want to kind of add one more thing, one more thing to this again as a historian, and especially since Michelle mentioned Bucha in the kind of the opening comments. One of the, as a historian, not just of the Russian Empire, but of the Holocaust, I think one of the big questions, right, is how do we find out what happened, especially when the genocide is successful enough that there are a lot of victims. And we now have scholars who have worked on helping uncover mass graves from the former Yugoslavia, from the Holocaust, and now in places like Bucha. And there's something obviously utterly horrifying, right, about the kind of skill set that you have, right, where there were literally, there's a scholar who helped uncover mass graves of Jews who were killed during the Holocaust in the last couple of decades, right? So graves that were not uncovered until a couple of decades ago. Some members of his team were still in Ukraine during the war, and when Bucha was liberated, they were literally there, kind of being able to switch gears from one horrific atrocity and the consequences of it to another. And one of the things that they specifically commented on was how eager a lot of people were to talk to them. There's kind of this desire to document, the faith on the part of many people in Ukraine that when they win the war, because of course they will win the war, there will be a time of reckoning, and there will be an opportunity to see justice and to see people who committed these war crimes prosecuted, and they are trying to document as much as possible through the pain, through the horror, kind of very explicitly that this is our responsibility and this is something that we have to do. So whether it's recording these moments of tragedy or helping identify bodies, a tremendous amount of work is happening, waiting for the moment where this evidence can be presented in an appropriate
You're
setting.
absolutely right. There's another film that Frontline made that aired in 2022 called Putin's War Crimes, Documenting War Crimes. It's available on YouTube, and it is about this very process of, in real time, trying to efficiently, quickly, accurately gather these stories and these the actual toll, so that when the time comes, it's all recorded.
A couple more questions, kind of specifically about the documentary. Why do you think some people were so hostile? I mean, there were a lot of people who wanted to document it, and there were some people who expressed a lot of anger towards the journalists. Why do you think that is?
Well, I guess the obvious answer is it's a very stressful time, and but you see even there are two moments in particular where people are frustrated visibly, in particular that I'm thinking of. One is when out on the street a woman comes to him and is yelling, "They attacked our home." He's clearly holding a camera and she's yelling at him, and so she is wanting to be heard, but he asks for her name and she says, "No, I don't have a name. Like, I don't want my name to be, associated." I can imagine being in that position myself personally. She's frustrated and she just doesn't, but don't write my name down. There was another moment where people who are hiding from shelling toward the end of the film are asking him who bombed the city. And that's a very important moment that there was discussion around how to include this, whether to include this. And I remember, because some people thought, well, it's confusing. If we're going to include it, we have to explain it or something. But actually, I think what it points to, and where we ended up deciding to keep it in, is that, and actually a lot of people we got feedback from who were Ukrainian were like, you got to keep it in because it's so representative of what was happening. it's a moment where you see the impact of the blackout that was happening. So, media towers were attacked at the beginning of the war. They weren't getting the information to be able to answer their own questions, like who's doing this to us? Why are they doing this? And so, that moment represents that frustration, that anger. And you think about, you see somebody with a camera and a press vest, you don't have any other form of communication. You can't call your family, you can't upload the video, you are so limited, but here's somebody with a vessel and you speak to it. And so you're going to be speaking to it with emotion. It's either going to be sadness or pleading or frustration. And so however that comes out, it's varied, but these were people in a terrible situation with no way of getting information out or in. And so they saw the team with a camera and spoke to them.
There was a question about the sand. There's a couple of recurring shots of sand kind of sifting through a person's hand. Mm-hmm. Was there significance to that shot?
So those are two sequences that are from Mstislav's own personal archive of footage from his many years of filming and his 10 years of conflict reporting. And I'll note that the beginning of his career as a war videographer and journalist was actually the downing of MH17. That's was a significant moment in Ukrainian history as well. And his first assignment was filming the aftermath of that. And he says that he remembers thinking in that moment how horrific it was that the footage he was gathering was going to change everything. And as we know, it didn't. And so in these moments where you see that footage, some of that footage is interspersed into those two sequences. There's also footage from his own personal filming, and those were moments in the story that were both turning points between acts, but they were also opportunities for his own personal reflection to come into play. And he asks questions about why he continues to do this work, why they continue to do the work. And then in the second sequence, begins again to try to answer why he does. And he says, someday if my daughters ask me, what did you do to stop this madness? I want to be able to give them an answer. And then he decides to keep going.
Very poignant shots, obviously. Do we know what happened to Vladimir and his family?
We do. So among the many people that they've kept in touch with from the film or in the story, Vladimir, just after taking the team and his family in the car that you see driving out of the city, he turned right back around and went back. He is actually from another city that had been occupied, and so he was displaced already in Mariupol and started a new life there with his family. And he actually said, I'm not doing that again. And so he brought his family away, and then he turned around and went back. And he's continued to stay there, not to Mariupol, of course, but continued to be in Donbass, in the area of eastern region of Ukraine, and not leave. He was actually injured. He's okay. But he was actually injured in a recent market attack where there was a double tap just within the past several months. He was responding, and there was another attack once the responders came in. And he had a punctured lung, and so he had to have some surgery and rest. He's doing okay now, but that's how Vladimir is.
Did anybody else reach out from the documentary? People who made it into the final version reach out to you? Have you heard from anybody?
They've heard from a lot. So in fact, the The first screening at the premiere in Ukraine was attended by many of the people that you see in the film, doctors and medics and individuals who, and Vladimir. Also, most recently, there was a screening where the young man who comes out of the maternity ward and is looking for his mom and says, "My mom," and the soldier holds his shoulders and says, "Where is she?" And then there's another shelling coming in, so they all run in and hide. He attended one of the screenings with his family and his mom, who's okay. And you know, otherwise, yeah, the families of the people you see, victims in the film, they've kept in touch with the reporters, and are in, you know, various parts of the world right now. So many people have had so much loss and displacement, loss in so many different ways. And so I think one of the most important things to me and to them and to everybody who worked on the film was the reception by the community the film was about. And so they're the screenings that have been attended and by people from Mariupol and from Ukraine have been very it's been very well received, and I'm glad that people feel like it's a film that represents what they experienced and they want people to see.
Are there any stories that didn't make it, that were too complicated to tell, that you wish you could have included that you didn't? Can you give us maybe one example of something like that, if you could think of one off the top of your head?
I mean, I remember there's a scene where a young man is playing a piano in a building that I think it's in the theater where people are hiding. And it was just this, you know, poignant moment of a young man playing piano and sort of talking about his experience so far. And we didn't end up including that in the story. It just didn't, like, it, you know, it didn't advance or like do anything that we weren't getting somewhere else. And those are the kinds of decisions you have to make when you're putting together what is ultimately a 94-minute film. And we, I think about that moment because I think about all the people that you see who are alive in the footage on that day, and you really don't know what happened to them afterward. And I say that in particular about anybody who was in sheltering in a theater like that, because the day after Mstislav and the team were able to escape, the drama theater in Mariupol was shelled. And they had reported from there. That's not the scene in the film that I'm talking about, just to be clear, but there's, you know, they went to that theater, very similar situation, many people hiding and staying there with their families. So the next day, that was when that theater was shelled, and they were able to, from afar, try to quickly assess the toll. Because they had seen it firsthand, they were able to provide a lot of information and reconstructed using forensic material what happened on the ground that day that they weren't physically able to show up with their cameras and document it. But if you think of those two things as like the Mariupol hospital bombing, the maternity hospital bombing, that they were able to arrive to, film, capture, gather all of that information and transmit it, versus what they had to do with the drama theater, which is reconstructing that from afar using, you know, filmed like people's cell phone camera footage and sort of testimony about how many people were there and what was that situation like. You know, it's a very different kind of reporting and journalism, and it's different impact. And I think both are such incredible contributions. But I know they felt really guilty that they weren't actually physically able to arrive to the drama theater and document the devastation of that because they had left the day earlier.
There are a number of questions about kind of, are you guys planning a follow-up? What is Mstislav working on right now? Is there anything in the works?
Yeah. So Mstislav is continuing to work for the Associated Press as a journalist, and he, as are Zhenya and Vasilisa. And yes, I am so thankful that Mstislav's experience was good enough that he wants to make more films. And again, I hope they're not all so devastating and put him in such danger, but this is a part of his work, and he takes it very seriously. And he's been covering the war since, since it started and well before, 2022. So yes, we are talking about what his next film could be, and I'm looking forward to working on that with him.
That's great. There was a question about what's happening in Mariupol today, and I don't know if you, it was actually, I don't know if you wanted to answer it, but I did see a couple of days ago, it was in the news, and I think the example I'm going to give, I want to preface it by saying that I think one of the many things that this documentary shows is the nature of this war and a Russian military strategy, right? That the Russian military strategy is essentially carrying out, attacking civilian targets and trying to cause as much damage and as much destruction to as many targets as possible, in the hope, right, that this is going to get people to no longer want to be a part of, no longer want the war to, to continue, and that's really kind of all that we see kind of over and over and over again. In the case of Mariupol, as a city that has been, that is now under Russian control, one of the reason that it was in the news in the last couple of days is that there was footage of real estate agents showing off, particularly areas downtown, right, that haven't been rebuilt, that are devastated, that you can buy very inexpensively now, because they are, and there's kind of a cutesy word for it, like ruin shopping, and the goal is to bring in Russians from Russia to buy up the properties and then renovate them, right? To completely transform, the city. And one of the things that is happening is that a lot of people who are still in Mariupol, who were there before the war, they are essentially being priced out of this new market, right? And so it really kind of the film shows the nature of the war. What we're seeing today in Mariupol is kind of the longer term plans that Russia has for this territory, right? The erasure of the Ukrainian component, the Ukrainian culture, and Ukrainian population, in order to be able to say that this is a Russian city, and kind of prove it through the population transfers.
That was what was so powerful to us about the footage that you see at the very end of the film, which Mstislav had helped to coordinate getting, but that was after the occupation, and it's those static shots at the sequence at the end of the film, and you see the just devastation and also a Russian flag waving, and the mass graves, and so sort of a peek inside what the city looked like in the aftermath. Since then, it has, as you suggested, and it has been now a process of trying to revitalize and cover up a lot of what happened, and rebuild, and so it
and rectify.
So it speaks to the importance of documenting in real time what actually did happen, because very quickly it can be erased. There's a quite chilling story that Mstislav has shared, and it's this idea that many of the buildings that you see shelled in the sequences in the film, they're filled with bodies still. People have not they haven't gone through and removed any, so the skeletons of the city, these buildings that have been shelled, they are then demolished to be then covered up and paved over with the very, rubble and debris of the people who are inside. And so you're truly paving the new roads of Mariupol, of an occupied Mariupol, with this material.
There was another, how much time, sorry, I can't see where, Art, how much time do we have left? Okay. There was one, I hate to do this in a film about Ukrainian voices, but there were a couple of questions specifically about Russia, not just the attitude towards this movie, but the questions about sort of Russian, whether people in Russia, believe in the propaganda, believe in the Russian version of the war. And I don't know if you wanted, I'm happy to say something about that.
Yeah, you might be able to speak better to that.
Okay. And so I think obviously it's hard. We have to be careful because Russia's not a free country, so that we cannot talk about sort of meaningful, scientifically conducted surveys and polling and so on. But I think one of the things, and it goes back to sort of Russia, this movie is not going to be screened in Russia, and I think that an important note to add to that is that the vast majority of people in Russia are not heartbroken over the fact that this is a movie that cannot be seen in Russia. That this is a story that is not part of kind of the imagination of the Russian population, and this is not a story that they're interested in hearing. There are some anti-war voices within Russia, but one of the things that has happened over the last, especially now as the war is almost in its two-year mark, is the extent to which the war has shifted to the background, right? War is background noise. The suffering of Ukrainians is fake news, and kind of the people of Russia have moved on. Now that it seems especially, and this is especially true, of course, right now, where it appears that the attention of the world is no longer quite as focused on Russia and the war in Ukraine, and this is the opportunity for Russia to sort of roll back some of the restrictions, some of the international pressure, in order to be able to keep doing what they are doing. And one of the questions was, is there a chance that this war could end, within the next 5 years? And I think it is very important when we think about the war, right, I don't know if people remember when the war started almost 2 years ago, but the vast majority of talking heads in Western news were preparing to say that Kiev was going to fall in 3 days, right? The assumption was that Kiev was going to fall, and of course it did not. I'm on record saying of course it wouldn't, but it's a different story. And so I think it's very, very important to note, right, the extent to which Ukraine, through the sacrifices, right, kind of the blood, sweat, and tears of the people of Ukraine, have defied international expectations when it came to the way that this war was supposed to play out. Not just expectations within Russia, where the assumption was 3 days and it would be over, but the expectations of the international community that sure, Russia, since it's a superpower, was going to be able to roll through Ukraine. And there's it's important for us to note, right, the extent to which we Western assumptions about Putin's power, maybe say more about Western assumptions about power than they do about actual actual Putin. But the courage and the sacrifices of the people of Ukraine are extremely important. At the same time, it's also very important to note that international support is key for Ukraine. If we're going to think about, if we want to think about, the war ending, Russia can afford to keep a war going indefinitely because they don't have to worry about in modern warfare, right? Especially in traditional war, there comes a point where a country cannot afford to keep losing, and especially losing manpower without expecting some kind of pushback from the population, elections or some kind of an uprising, because the Russian state is constructed in such a way, right, where all opposition has been systematically dismantled in the years leading up to the war. There's no danger to the regime, regardless of whether the war is going well or not, especially since through propaganda they can keep the war going well, indefinitely. And so Russia can afford to keep this thing going regardless of how badly it's going for them. And so for the war to end, Ukraine needs support and Ukraine needs, needs assistance. So if we're kind of, one of the other big questions that was asked was, what can we in Fort Wayne do to help? Certainly, if this is important, and again, it's, I want to be clear, right? Obviously, I'm a human being and I get to have a point of view, right? But the important thing here is that we live in a political system, right, where our elected officials are supposed to respond to what we believe. And so if you feel that Ukraine deserves support, that Ukraine should not continue to have to be overrun by Russia, that Russia should not be allowed to continue to wage a genocidal war on the territory of Ukraine, then the important thing to do is to convey that to your elected officials, right? Your elected officials need to hear that this is something that you, as an Indianian, as a Hoosier, that's the right word, as a Hoosier, care about. I think that's one very, very important way that we can make sure that our elected officials can understand that this is an issue that is important to us, especially when there's so much going on, that it's very easy to get distracted, especially when there may be other interests that would like the tension to be kind of removed from Russia. There are also lots of organizations all over the world, including in the United States, that do work helping support Ukraine. There are some representatives here in the audience from one of those organizations based in Indianapolis, and they have a table outside. So as you're leaving, if you didn't already grab their stuff before, there's a table kind of on your way out that you can get materials from them. But there are a lot of other organizations that work to help support, collect resources for victims of the war, and kind of provide support in various other ways.
Yeah, no, and I'll put a plug in for supporting journalism and journalists as well. And the reason why the team on the ground had ultimately had resources and the ability to continue doing this work and some oversight from the Associated Press and then later from Frontline PBS was because we have a strong culture here, right now at least, of supporting journalism and freedom of the press and the ability to do that work seriously and use it whenever we are talking about, policy decisions and what our representatives decide to do or not to do. And so continuing to support that effort, I think, is also a part of the larger picture.
And then, of course, applying our critical thinking skills. As a professor of history, I feel it's also important to plug, critical thinking in the way that we consume media and in the way we consume information to make sure that we are kind of thinking seriously about what we believe, what we don't believe, whose voices we amplify, and whose voices maybe we shouldn't be amplifying.
Yeah, media literacy now in our very volatile world and where technology is changing so much is all the more important. Yeah, agreed.
Art. Okay.
Thank you so much for staying and for being here.
And for all the work that you did. Thank you.
I took a picture of everybody watching from behind, of people watching the film, and sent it to Mstislav, and he is very grateful for you all being here today. So thank you.
One more time, can we thank